Okay, good morning, everyone. Um, just about to get started now. Thank you all for joining this morning. We're looking forward to an engaging session um, here under the Strengthening Energy Sector Resilience in Jamaica program. We have put together this webinar to share some research findings and opportunities for private sector engagement in solar PV standards development for the country. This program, I'm sure many of you here have already interfaced with our program. So you know that this program is funded through the kind support of USAID that drives the Jamaica Energy Resilience Alliance. So our goal today really is to share findings from a bit of research, a white paper that CADMOS has undertaken to support solar PV standards development in Jamaica. I'll quickly take you through what our agenda will be for the day. First, we'll be going over a brief introduction of what exactly SESR Jamaica is, as well as what this bit of research that has been done is really about. We'll get into the current context locally here in Jamaica for solar PV standards, and then we'll take you through some of the best practices internationally. Under this research, we would have also undertaken a survey to get some industry. So we'll take you through some of the results of that survey, and then we'll come to some of the suggested standards, enforcement mechanisms, and other compliance methodologies that we are suggesting. We'll also briefly go through an overview of what BSJ's standards development process is, and then we'll go to a facilitated question and answer session that will follow these presentations. The chat function, however, is open to everyone in real time. So if you have questions as presenters are speaking, please go ahead and drop them in the chat function, and our team will be sure to pick those up so that they can be responded to during the Q&A session. All right, I'd like to take you quickly, just before we move to the introduction, to look at who our speakers will be for today. So my name is Tiffany Arnold. I am the coordinator of the Jamaica Energy Resilience Alliance that I'll tell you a bit about in a second. I'm also joined today by my colleague, Andrew Whiteman, who will be one of our presenters, Will Sloan, Mark Dennis, as well as Jason Robinson of the Jamaica Renewable Energy Association and SolarBuzz. Okay, so now to briefly take you through an introduction of the SESR Jamaica program and the standards analysis. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so the scope of the analysis that was done is really stemming from the Ministry of Science, Energy, Telecommunications and Transport, MSET. As a member of the BSJ's Electrical Products and Practices Committee, they would have requested from CADMOS under the SESR program a bit of research to assess and provide recommendations to inform adaptation of additional standards for solar PV in Jamaica. In this research, CADMOS reviewed international best practices and also, as I would have mentioned earlier, conducted a survey of Jamaica's PV industry representatives to develop recommendations for standards, as well as compliance and enforcement mechanisms. Again, as I would have mentioned earlier, this analysis was conducted under and supports objectives of the Strengthening Energy Sector Resilience in Jamaica program, SESR Jamaica, and this is a program of USAID Jamaica and the Jamaica Energy Resilience Alliance. CADMOS, who many of the presenters here today will be from CADMOS, is the lead implementing partner of SESR Jamaica. So just a bit more on this program. It is a 3-year program, and its main goal is really to support the acceleration of Jamaica's energy sector to withstand and rebound from natural disasters through the adoption of resilient solar PV and PV+. The SESR Jamaica program has a collaboration of industry partners as well as other nonprofits and academic partners that support the same goal. These partners would include JMEA, JHTA, amongst others. And really, in practice, how SESR Jamaica operates is that we provide free consultations for third party and storage experts. And we also allow for access to well-qualified solar installers, as well as helping these businesses under JMEA and JHTA to identify the best available financing for suggested PV and PV plus systems. Slide, please. Again, to explain a bit about what JERA is. JERA is an alliance. It's a grouping of both Jamaican and international private sector and nonprofit organizations that are committed to this goal of resilient energy through the adoption of renewable energy in Jamaica. Our members include CADMOS, as I would have mentioned, which is a US-based consulting firm that specializes in environmental and energy consulting. As well as partners like GSI, Green Solutions International, who support us in training and ensuring that the market is well developed with competent and well-qualified training professionals. JHTA and JMEA are our trade association partners, and they support us in doing outreach to their membership to explain the benefits of solar, as well as to directly provide one-on-one hands-on consultation with these businesses as the best possible solutions of solar for them. We also have LASCO as a partner who is currently implementing a pilot project that will see the implementation of a solar system at their facilities that will be used for demonstration to industry as well as to academia of the benefits of solar for industry. We also have Wigton and WRB Energy, who are part of our development portfolio. They provide lease financing and PV solutions to clients under the JERA program. Next slide, please. Okay, so I would have started to allude to some of the key activities under SESR Jamaica, but just to briefly go through where this particular webinar sits within our overall scope of work. So what I would have been describing before is what we call our market development or demand aggregation work. And with that, you see us doing one-on-one hands-on work with businesses through the JMEA, JHTA, and providing that free consulting service as to the best fit solar practices and solar systems for their businesses. But where this particular webinar falls is under the scope of work where we're looking at what we call soft costs. Those are barriers to greater adoption of solar within Jamaica. So this webinar, the resources and recommendations that are developed to support this webinar fall under this aspect of our scope of work. I would have also mentioned briefly the pilot project that is being done at LASCO, as well as through GSI, our training partner, the workforce development that has been done under our program to ensure that, as I said, they're competent professionals that can be trusted and are qualified to install solar PV systems. So with that, I'm going to start handing over now to Will Sloan, who will take you through a bit of an explanation of what we refer to as PV plus and PV soft costs to greater contextualize this webinar. Will?
Thank you, Tiffany. Great. So what do we mean by PV and PV plus soft costs? So when we refer to soft costs, we are essentially referring to any non-equipment costs of a PV and PV plus system that is passed on to the customer. So these include things like customer acquisition costs, including advertising and marketing expenditures, installation and maintenance costs, and workforce development costs, such as the recruitment and training of installers, legal and regulatory costs, like the fees and time spent navigating regulatory processes for system approval, and financing costs, including interest payments on loans. So in the US, previous work by the Department of Energy had estimated that soft costs could account for as much as 64% of the total system cost of a PV or PV plus system. And so targeted interventions aimed at reducing soft costs can have a significant impact on overall PV and PV plus system costs, and ultimately a significant impact on growing the market. Next slide, please. So there's been a good deal of work to suggest that PV standards, including PV equipment, performance, and safety standards, can have an impact on reducing soft costs, particularly those that stem from a lack of consumer or financier confidence in the performance of PV systems. So for example, this work from the US National Renewable Energy Laboratory examined the issue of low quality PV systems in the market and suggested that suboptimal PV system performance and safety incidents can have downstream impacts on customer adoption because of unmet expectations and negative publicity. So in effect, low quality systems can reduce overall developer, investor, and consumer confidence in solar products. This in turn leads to higher financing costs from the higher perceived risk on the part of investors, higher customer acquisition costs, and of course, higher operations and maintenance costs resulting from lower quality equipment or installation. And so the adoption of PV performance and safety standards in turn can have an effect of reducing these costs by increasing consumer and investor confidence. So putting some downward pressure on the financing costs and customer acquisition costs, and reducing or avoiding future operations and maintenance costs from otherwise less reliable equipment. Next slide. However, we also do recognize that standards adoption can contribute to increases in other cost categories, such as higher PV equipment costs, as manufacturers typically assume the cost of equipment certification, higher regulatory soft costs stemming from additional costs assumed by installers to comply with associated regulatory processes, and potential supply chain soft costs related to logistics or installation delays, especially if there are limited existing products in the market that comply with the adopted standards. However, literature on PV standards largely suggests that the benefits of standards adoption outweigh their costs, both in terms of the financial returns for PV consumers and investors, improved system performance, and the impacts on overall market expansion from increased consumer and investor confidence in PV systems. So this hypothesis is really the basis of our PV standards work under this project. And our engagement with market stakeholders has been aimed at understanding the potential soft cost impacts of PV standards adoption in Jamaica. And with that, I will ask to hand it over to Jason Robinson.
Morning, everybody. Can you hear me? I hope so.
Yes, we're hearing Jason.
Great. All right. Next slide, please. So I will speak on the current context of the solar PV standards in Jamaica. I'll read through these and then give some opinions from the Jamaica Renewable Energy Association standpoint. So the Bureau of Standards, BSJ, the statutory body established by the Standards Act in '69, has a mandate to promote and encourage standardization in relation to commodities process practices, including setting quality assurance and safety standards for economic industries in Jamaica. They've adopted two standards that are relevant to the solar PV industry. The UL, which most people are familiar with, which is Underwriters Laboratory Standard of 1741, and this is for inverter safety under BSJ Standards JS 330 2016. The standard applies to JPS standard offer contracts for distributed energy resources connecting to the electricity grid for net billing, auxiliary and power wheeling connections. BSJ also provides a list of approved inverters per the net billing program of 2016. The International Electrotechnical Commission, IEC 6904 standards to measure PV modules against manufacturer specifications if requested. But however, to date, the BSJ's involvement in the industry has primarily focused on reviewing and validating inverter spec sheets for inverters that are not already on the approved list, according to engagement with BSJ conducted by the CADMA staff in 2022. Next slide, please. The opportunity for the additional PV standards adoption, in Jamaica, the CADMA conducted a review of the PV standards. The adoption in other jurisdictions and identified opportunities for adoption of additional PV standards in Jamaica. Currently, Jamaica does not have standards like equipment safety and performance, nor associated compliance and enforcement mechanisms that are common in industry practices. I do want to thank CADMA for the work they have done, especially in this area, because it is extremely important. The Jamaica Renewable Energy Association does support certain standards being implemented in the industry. We think that even though certain costs of equipment, yes, would go up if you're forced to buy higher quality equipment, we do think that this would be offset, as Will mentioned, by the banks having more confidence in financing more solar projects, residential and commercial. So therefore, there'll be more projects being financed. So inevitably, installers will make more revenue. The bank's biggest concerns, obviously, are defaults on solar energy loans. Well, defaults on loans in general, but specifically, when it comes to solar, their concern is how do we get back the equipment? So we think that standards will give them some more confidence. As I mentioned, it'll allow systems to definitely perform more to the level as promised and as expected, which will, to protect the investments. And that way you'll have fewer defaults on loans due to systems not working, and we will have more PV financing and more PV deployed in Jamaica. One of the concerns, some of the concerns that the association has with the BSG's current inverter approval process, obviously, is that it's a bit antiquated. I mean, this same system, I remember when it was put in place 10 to 11 years ago, back when JPS was in charge of the net billing process. So, currently, if an inverter, from back then, if an inverter is not on the list and a company wants to introduce a new size inverter or a new brand inverter, they have to apply to BSJ and they pay all the fees. I think it's close, probably anywhere from 15 to 30,000 Jamaican dollars to get that inverter on the list. Once the inverter is approved, this list is put on the MSET list that is, as again was mentioned earlier, which is only used for net billing. So inverters that are not used in net billing cases, such as battery storage, etc., the Bureau of Standards has no idea what these inverters are, nor do they have to approve them. And I will tell you that the industry has shifted from 10 years ago when everything was 95% grid tie for commercial industries who were the first movers in solar, to about 80 to 90% now jobs are battery storage, residential, and small commercial storage, which means these systems don't have to go through any sort of inverter list to install because they're not applying for net billing. A lot of clients who are even doing grid tie are not applying for net billing. Again, that process of net billing being so much red tape has just forced people to avoid it. There's a lot of new companies, as you know, on the market, and these guys are just trying to sell, so they don't have time to be going through that red tape process for the net billing license. So they're just suppressing the energy. Again, nothing being having to go to the BSJ. So those are things that definitely need to be looked at. Again, if you're putting an inverter that's already on the list with the BSJ, and it's in the same family, but it's a different size, they expect you to pay that $20,000 to $30,000. So if there's a Fronius 10 kilowatt inverter, but you want to put in a Fronius 7 kilowatt inverter, but no one has yet used a 7 kilowatt, even though it's in the exact same family, the BSJ expects you to pay $30,000 for that smaller inverter with the exact same specs. To us, that needs to change. Again, I think that's from way back when JPS used to be in charge of net billing, and they weren't as friendly to solar as they are now. So I think some of these practices need to change. The fees need to change, come down, maybe even be white, maybe not even have any fees, in my opinion. For instance, we don't do this for generators. Essentially, a generator can provide you power to your home or business. We don't have to go to the BSJ to get any approval for generators. Why are we so strict on solar? Again, I think it stems back to the initial setup of the program. Lastly, I think we have gone past the days of having to have such burden and red tape when it comes to getting approvals for certain standards in our approach of taxing the installers. We now have a Vision 2030. Government is on board. I think the process needs to become less expensive from the association's point of view, more all-encompassing, and to keep up with the modern solar industry. So thank you. That's it for me. I look forward to answering any questions at the end of the presentations.
Great, thank you, Jason. We'll move now to Andrew, who will speak on an overview of international PV plus standards and best practices. Andrew?
Yeah, thank you, Tiffany. And good to see everyone on this call, some of whom have been really helpful in helping us come up with our suggestions. Some of you, we talked on the phone about this, and others have taken our survey, which we'll talk about. And good to see some representatives from the financial community. Some of us met last September at our seminar on financing, and we hope this is a good companion to those presentations. And as you know, as we mentioned, please feel free to pose questions in the chat, and we'll have opportunity for further questions after the presentation. Next slide. So just to build upon Will and Tiffany and Jason's presentations, we wanted to test this hypothesis that these standards can reduce soft costs and think about this in terms of what's relevant to Jamaica. And so we've done work to understand best practices and how standards are adopted in the market overall, and then taken a survey to understand how relevant these best practices would be to Jamaica. We want to make this a streamlined effort while also promoting quality in the marketplace. And then we do make specific suggestions for BSJ's consideration. These suggestions BSJ is currently reviewing our suggestions. What we've suggested are not the views of BSJ, and they haven't been officially adopted. So we're here to seek your feedback, and BSJ MSET is definitely happy to hear further perspectives, which we've promised to share with them. So just a little context on how the standards development process works. It's generally not a standards institute that will develop their own standards. It's rather that they'll adopt standards that other international organizations develop. And it's up to the private sector to show compliance with those standards. And also, it's noted that manufacturers are typically the ones that, at least for equipment standards, they're the ones that already do testing. There are third-party laboratories that will do this testing, and manufacturers will pay for that cost. And most products on the marketplace are standardized, but our survey results do show that perhaps some sectors are not, or certain sectors or market segments maybe aren't using standardized products, kind of more cost-conscious customers. But we want to share some additional information why we think maybe using new products makes sense in the long run. So there are, as I mentioned, there are international organizations that focus on standards development. Jason mentioned Underwriter Laboratories. Some of these are more regionally focused. UL is North America. There's CE, which is Europe focused. Germany has its own standards. And then there are international standards organizations that are more applicable as minimum requirements that all electricity systems would benefit from. And IEC is the main one. IEEE is another. There are a few others, but those are the most commonly adopted. And it's noted, we mentioned that there are a lot of products in the marketplace that are standardized already, but they're not always standard against the same system. Sometimes it's UL, sometimes it's IEC. And so we want to do some additional work to understand what's available in Jamaica and what are trends in peer countries and other countries that have developed solar markets. Next slide. We looked at a few jurisdictions in the US with an emphasis on Florida and Puerto Rico, California, that have all made progress with solar PV deployment. Florida and Puerto Rico have a similar climate and storm profile to Jamaica. We looked at Barbados, and then a couple other countries in Africa that also have a similar renewable energy goals and have made a similar amount of progress, or kind of on that same trajectory with Jamaica in this market space. We've talked about equipment standards, but there are also a number of other standards that these countries, these jurisdictions have adopted. And then other factors like certification processes, enforcement, system size limits, equipment lists. And so we want to share a little bit about that. We can get into the more specific suggestions later on. Next slide. So what is the scope of each standard? Well, this is a little technical, but and the point here is to just tell a little more about this and emphasize that standards do promote quality in the market. And we also can share some results of why others think that from our survey results. Equipment standards, we mentioned safety and performance. Safety, something like, is the panel going to shock you, or is it going to catch on fire? There's testing that's done for that. Performance there are a lot of performance measurements that are relevant to storms, wind speed testing, hail testing, submersion underwater. And these are generally found on equipment specification lists. Pretty much every technology will put out their specification lists and list their certifications. You can see the red oval here will list some of these standards that are already adopted. Interconnection requirements, voltage, frequency, that kind of thing. And that's one aspect of it, more electrical. And then there are also safety and performance for inverters as well. There are wiring standards specific to solar PV. There's performance testing. An organization can test against manufacturer specifications. BSJ, we understand, is willing to do that some. And then there are additional hurricane standards for salt mist corrosion, for climate, for other aspects of structural design, installation, procurement, specific to countries in hurricane zones. Next slide. And countries often will have an enforcement mechanism at time of system commissioning. Sometimes there's a managed equipment list. In California, for example, that's often tied to incentive payments. In other jurisdictions, that list is for just a reference only. Typically, it's not a requirement for interconnection, and we can get into that, building upon what Jason has talked about the inverter list. And some jurisdictions do set system size limits. Only a certain class of systems standards would be applicable to those system sizes. Next slide. So as we mentioned, this is a broad survey. Not all of these standards are applicable to each country. That's just a full list providing scope. And before we make suggestions, we want to hear from the sector. We created a survey to understand what products are available in the market, how price sensitive is the market, what are the expectations of costs by adopting additional products from those that understand these markets quite well, and ask questions about the governance structure and appropriate enforcement mechanisms. And so as mentioned, we did run a survey with focusing on the solar PV installers. and has some insights to share. My colleague Mark Dennis will go over that in just a moment. And then, yeah, as mentioned, at the end of the presentation, we'd like to validate some of those assumptions as there are other folks on this call whose opinions we definitely value and would like to hear from as relevant. So I'll pass this over to Mark.
Hi, thanks, Andrew. Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone's having a sunny day today, considering what we've been through over the past 3 days with over 300 millimeters of rain. So Andrew just gave pretty much a great introduction to the survey that we did, which was essentially to get feedback from players in the industry, installers in particular, as to how they expect, the standards that are coming to impact the operations, how they expect it to impact product availability, how they see enforcement taking place. And so, with that goal in mind, we designed this online survey and we ran it from August 5th to August 31st. And the survey was distributed predominantly through the Jamaica Renewable Energy Association. Thanks again to Jason and David Barrett for assisting on that front. We managed to get 12 responses from 11 different solar PV companies. Not as many responses as we would have liked, but what we were happy with was the type of companies that responded, which were solar companies that pretty much covered the full gamut, or the full solar process, if you want to call it that, from installation to training to distribution, maintenance, engineering, right through to commissioning. So companies that we know for a fact that standards would definitely have an impact on. And as I would have mentioned, the survey looked at enforcement and product availability, etc. So going into the results, most products for PV systems in Jamaica are compliant with standards. So the majority of respondents would have indicated that the main components in particular that we would have listed in the survey, panels, inverters, batteries, charge controllers, that they tend to be compliant with some form of product standard. As is expected though with any survey, you're really just getting a representation of a fraction of the market. Coming out of the survey, and we know as well as stakeholders in the industry that there are many other players that will use substandard equipment, low quality equipment that doesn't conform to some of the well-known UL and IEEE standards. And we know the primary motivation for that oftentimes is to just ensure that they can compete at a much lower cost compared to more reputable installers. Additionally, respondents also indicated that there might be supply chain disruptions for some companies. That's expected, again, for those installers that may tend to use subpar equipment. Mandatory standards, of course, would force them to change suppliers, or may force them to compare their suppliers to get their equipment certified to the mandatory standards, or supply different equipment altogether. Next slide. As would have been indicated in previous slides by Jason and other members of the team, and the survey results confirmed as well that higher upfront costs are expected. I mean, the truth is, if you're going to purchase higher quality equipment, as Jason put it, you can expect to pay a bit of a premium. However, on the flip side, higher quality equipment means increased reliability, increased resilience in your system, which will often lead to lower operations and maintenance costs. And of course, a knock-on effect of that, for our bankers that are here, our financiers that are here, we know that the financing costs tend to be calculated based on the perceived risk. And so with increased resilience and reliability, those perceived risks are mitigated in a big way, which is expected to reduce financing costs. And the surveys, again, would have confirmed that theory. Next slide. In general, respondents are overwhelmingly in support of additional PV system standards and enforcement. Virtually all our respondents said that they would support equipment safety performance standards, and virtually all respondents indicated that all system capacities, so from small systems to large systems, should be subject to standards. And that was very encouraging to see, because it confirms, that our installers, our stakeholders really want to protect this industry and really want to see it accomplish or achieve the potential that we all know that it can achieve. When asked about enforcement, there were three main institutions or agencies that were identified or nominated by our respondents. The first being the BSJ, our standards body. The second being the Government Electrical Regulator, GER. And the third being the Ministry of Science, Energy, Telecommunications, and Transport. And when also asked at what stage do we believe that standards should be enforced, the majority, about half of our respondents, indicated that it should happen at the commissioning stage. The minority, though, indicated that it really should happen much earlier at the import stage. Next slide. So again, the survey results would have shown, most importantly, overwhelming support for standardizing the industry even more, regardless of the fact that it's going to result in increased upfront costs. But I think we're all on the same page that the reduced O&M costs and reduced financing costs and the just overall value that it will bring to the industry is worth, definitely worth additional standards coming into the marketplace. I'm going to switch back over to Andrew, who will speak further on suggested standards, compliance, and enforcement mechanisms. Andrew.
Thanks, Mark. So we heard about a little bit about what each standard in the market comprises from some of the research we've done, and we learned about the hypothesis on the reduction of soft costs, which is validated in part by our surveys, and we learned in the survey specific products that are available in Jamaica currently, and at least for equipment, that allowed us to do a little research on looking at spec sheets and comparing what's available to what other countries have adopted. And there's some clear, for equipment, but some of those other standards that we analyzed, there are some clear suggestions for consideration at BSJ. First, solar PV modules, performance and safety standards. Virtually all products are compliant with IEC, and each country we surveyed is also compliant or has IEC as a requirement. And for battery storage, the same is true for the safety standard. The Underwriter Laboratories standard is the industry benchmark and is adopted by virtually all products listed in our survey. Granted, there's opportunity for further validation of the market. We know what Mark had mentioned, our survey sample size was valuable, but additional perspectives are also welcome. We also suggest that oftentimes the guidelines for PV installation structural design are included in national building codes. And one of our project partners, the Rocky Mountain Institute, publishes something called the Solar Under Storm series that has recommended measures for structural design and installation procurement that could be considered included in the National Building Code. And so that document is managed by BSJ. Next slide. Some other standards that we think warrant further consultation. We are in favor of these, but think maybe it does require further discussions, would be the salt corrosion standard. This is very relevant to a island nation, but we didn't see strong compliance with PV modules in the marketplace. So further validation with the industry on that compliance, maybe some further perspectives on that, or consultation with Barbados National Standards Institution can better assess adoption of that. So we recommend or suggesting that BSJ potentially seek further information from Barbados and other stakeholders. There is opportunity for electrical wiring requirements specific to solar PV in the U.S. National Electric Code. There are guidelines for that, and IEC puts out standards on that front. But the OUR, as other countries in our survey, has a book of codes that does include electrical wiring requirements. The JERA does have an inspection process relevant to PV systems. And so that's strong, and there could be an opportunity for the experts on the BSJ to consider that if so desired and relevant. Next slide. So there's certain standards that, the goal of this is to promote quality, but also not put onerous requirements, too much red tape onto where not necessary. Inverter performance, there isn't a standard for that that's widely adopted. Other component parts, racking, surge protectors, that kind of thing, they are generally standardized. Maybe the standards vary a little bit, but we don't recommend that it's necessary to have one for those kind of ancillary components. And then additional testing, we suggest that relying on the manufacturer's certifications instead of adopting additional testing protocols. Next slide. So for thinking about certification, enforcement, size limits, we suggest that all systems be subject to the same requirements. And we do suggest an enforcement mechanism. It seems like the electrical design inspection process managed by the JER could be a time for seeking compliance with those standards, or potentially with any building permitting processes as that's relevant. So it would really be at the time of system commissioning, which was validated by our survey results. And in terms of the equipment list, we do suggest that an equipment list would be useful as a resource. We haven't explicitly recommended that the standards be a prerequisite for interconnection applications, as we're seeking to, make sure that it's the same process of enforcement for standalone systems as well. And, maybe with some of the perspectives on that process, perhaps the enforcement is best suited for the system commissioning. That being said, equipment lists are useful as guidelines, and raising awareness of those requirements is also important for installers that may be looking to upgrade their equipment or establish new product lists or supply chains. Next slide. So as a summary of these presentations, the survey results do validate our hypothesis or the industry literature on soft cost reduction, at least the perception of market participants. And international examples and our survey results do validate recommendations for additional equipment standards. Countries like Jamaica that have made a lot of good progress on solar PV development have adopted standards, and there's at least that correlation of market development and supported by our survey. And that there is a stakeholder engagement process with the BSJ, which we'll speak about just after these takeaways. And so we have recommended that the BSJ discuss these findings with industry stakeholders, and particularly around enforcement mechanisms, those that are subject to these requirements, suggesting that this is an important area for focus, is how this affects their business, and wanting to make sure that views are heard on that front. And yeah, then you know, any standards regime is going to require education campaigns to ensure customers are aware of requirements. It could be this opportunity for an online interface that lists instructions for enforcement and provides certified equipment lists. And California and Florida can provide some examples on that. And that's so we've suggested that BSJ consider adopting those portals. Next slide. So I'll pass it back to Mark to speak a little bit about the BSJ's formal standards development process and some suggested areas for focus in that process.
Thanks, Andrew. Next slide. All right, so for the sake of time, I won't go through each step in the BSJ standard development process. I will indicate that it's the process is actually available on the BSJ website. In fact, the flowchart that you're looking here on your screen was actually copied from that BSJ website. So at your own leisure, when you have some time, you could go to the BSJ website, or you could just type in BSJ standards development process, and you can find the flowchart there. Where I will focus a little bit is on step 5, which we've circled there. So there is going to be an opportunity in the process to provide your feedback directly to the technical committee. It's a 60-day consultation process. However, if you wish to be more integrally involved in this development process, you can actually express your interest to the BSJ to join that committee. The BSJ will make a determination, of course, based on your skill set, your background, to determine if you can make a substantive contribution. But really, anybody can join the committee. For example, you know, we're aware that there is at least one university student that's on the committee currently. So again, as long as you can make a contribution, and the BSJ will make that determination, you can sit on that committee and be involved in the process. If you want to wait until the public consultation comes around, we do have some suggested areas of focus for that public consultation. And of course, this list is by no means exhaustive. And these are all areas that we would have touched on throughout the presentation. So product availability in the marketplace, supply chain consideration, which I would have mentioned earlier, that we expect some of that to be disrupted. So that needs to be fleshed out. Suggested compliance and enforcement mechanisms and entities. We do know that Jamaica doesn't have the best track record when it comes to enforcement. So that's definitely an area that we believe strongly would need to be streamlined during a consultation period. And lastly, but of course, by no means least, is an online interface that lists instructions for certification and enforcement, as well as certified equipment list. And Jason would have spoke at length on this last point here. What we really want to see, or rather, let me state it this way, we do believe that there's a lot of room for improvement for the current process as it obtains now, where there's a list of, currently there's a list of approved inverters, and you have to go through this process of paying and, you know, to get different variations of an inverter or different models certified. So we do believe during this consultation process, it's a ripe opportunity to have that process revamped, improved. We do think ideally, still, it would be very nice to have this resource that installers, financiers, whoever is interested can go to confirm that a component that they're planning to import or procure would be approved based on the standards that are to come. So again, this is not exhaustive. And I mean, you know, the idea is really to just give you, I'm going to use the word prime, to prime you in preparation for that consultation. So hopefully everyone that's in this room today can make some substantial contributions when that consultation period comes around.